The Phantom Hitchhiker. Daniel Miller, a truck driver in his late 20s, had been on the road for years, navigating the vast highways that crisscrossed the United States. His job kept him away from home for long stretches, but he loved the freedom of the open road and the thrill of new adventures. Little did he know that one fateful night, he would encounter something that would change his perception of the road forever. It was a chilly autumn evening, and Daniel was driving through the rural backroads of Kentucky after delivering a load in Lexington. The sun had set, leaving a crescent moon to illuminate the winding roads ahead. As he drove, the trees swayed gently in the breeze, casting eerie shadows across the highway. With his favorite classic rock station playing softly on the radio, he felt at ease, but that feeling would soon vanish. About 2 hours into his drive, Daniel noticed a figure standing by the side of the road. It was a young woman, drenched in a long white dress that billowed around her like mist. Her hair hung loose, and she looked disheveled, as if she had just come from a party, but was now lost and alone. Daniel's heart went out to her. It was rare to see anyone out here in the middle of nowhere, especially a woman in such a state. He slowed down and rolled down his window. "Hey, are you okay?" he called out. The woman turned to him, her eyes wide and pleading. "Can you give me a ride? I need to get to Masonville," she replied, her voice trembling. Daniel looked at her closely. There was something unsettling about her demeanor, but he brushed it off as his imagination running wild. After all, he had seen his fair share of hitchhikers over the years. He waved her over, and she climbed into the passenger seat. "Thank you so much," she said, smiling faintly. "My name is Lila." "Nice to meet you, Lila. I'm Daniel. What are you doing out here all alone?" he asked as he merged back onto the highway. "I was at a party nearby, but I missed my ride home," she explained, her gaze fixed out the window. "I didn't think anyone would stop for me." They drove in silence for a while, the radio playing softly in the background. Daniel stole glances at Lila, noting her delicate features and the way the moonlight made her skin glow. But something felt off. The air around her was cool, too cool for a warm autumn night. "Where exactly in Masonville do you live?" Daniel finally asked, hoping to break the growing tension. "I live on Riverside Lane," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel frowned, trying to recall where that was. "I think I know where that is. It's not far from here." As they drove deeper into the night, Daniel felt increasingly uneasy. Lila had fallen silent, staring out the window as if lost in thought. He wanted to make conversation, but her demeanor kept him at bay. Suddenly, Lila spoke again, her voice heavy with emotion. "Do you believe in ghosts, Daniel?" she asked, her eyes glimmering in the low light. "Ghosts? I've heard stories, but I've never seen one," he replied, chuckling nervously. "Why do you ask?" "I used to live in Masonville," she said, her tone turning somber, "but I died there." Daniel's heart raced. "What do you mean you died?" Leela turned to him, her expression haunting. "I was in a car accident on the way home from a party just like the one I was at tonight. I didn't make it." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and he glanced at Lila again. She was staring at him, her eyes filled with sorrow. "I need you to take me home," she pleaded, her voice trembling. What do you mean? You just said," he stammered, unable to comprehend her words. "I know I'm dead," she said, her voice a whisper. "But I can't move on until someone knows my story. Please, take me to Riverside Lane." Against his better judgment, Daniel nodded. He felt a strange connection to her, as if he were meant to help her. They drove in silence for what felt like an eternity, the only sounds coming from the tires rolling over the asphalt and the soft hum of the engine. Eventually, they arrived at Riverside Lane. Lila directed him to a quaint old house nestled at the end of the street. Its windows were dark, and the yard was overgrown, giving the place an abandoned feel. "This is it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for bringing me home." Daniel parked the truck and turned to her, his heart pounding. "Are you sure you want to get out?" Lila nodded, a serene smile spreading across her face. "I need to go. Thank you for listening. I hope you find peace on your journeys." As she opened the door, a gust of wind rushed through the cab, causing Daniel to shiver. He watched as Lila stepped out and walked toward the house. Just before she reached the door, she turned back to look at him one last time. "Don't forget my story," she whispered before vanishing into thin air. Daniel's heart raced as he blinked, trying to process what had just happened. He scrambled out of the truck and rushed to the front door, but it was locked tight. He knocked frantically, but there was no response. Panic rising in his chest, he pulled out his phone and called the local police. "I need help. I just dropped off a woman who said she died in a car accident, and I can't find her." The operator on the other end was confused, but assured him they would send someone to investigate. Daniel waited, his mind racing. He had just given a ride to a ghost. When the police arrived, Daniel explained everything, but they only found an empty house. The officers searched the area but reported that no one had lived there for years. It turned out that Lila's car accident had occurred exactly where Daniel had picked her up, the very same spot. Over the next few days, Daniel couldn't shake the encounter from his mind. He researched Lila's story and discovered that the accident had been a local tragedy. A young woman with a bright future snuffed out too soon, leaving behind friends and family who had never fully healed from the loss. Determined to honor Lila's memory, Daniel wrote a detailed account of his encounter and shared it online, hoping to give her story the recognition it deserved. People began to respond, sharing their own ghost stories and experiences with the supernatural, igniting a dialogue about the unexplainable. Months later, as Daniel continued his travels, he would often think of Lila and the night they shared together. Her memory became a part of him, a reminder that there are stories left untold, and sometimes those who have passed on seek the living to help them find peace. Every time he drove down those quiet country roads, he felt a sense of calm wash over him, knowing he had helped a lost soul find her way home. And though he would never forget the eerie encounter, he also learned to embrace the mysteries of life and death that awaited him on the open road. The Whispering Woman on the Road. Rahul and his group of friends had been driving for hours, their weekend trip to the hill station drawing to a close. It was late, far later than they had planned to be on the road, but they had lingered at their campsite, laughing and sharing stories around the fire. Now, the air inside the car was thick with exhaustion, the glow of the dashboard the only light on the narrow, winding road that stretched ahead of them like a dark ribbon. The road they had chosen to take back to the city was notorious among the locals, often referred to as the Whispering Road. It was an old highway that snaked through dense forests and overgrown hills. Few people used it anymore, as it had gained a reputation for being haunted. Stories of ghostly encounters and strange occurrences abounded, whispered in hushed tones by those who dared to share them. Rahul had heard some of those stories before, tales of strange apparitions, shadowy figures appearing out of nowhere, and voices in the night. But, like many, he had dismissed them as just another piece of local folklore, until that night. As they drove deeper into the forest, the mood in the car grew quieter. The lively chatter from earlier had died down, replaced by an uneasy silence. The trees outside loomed tall and menacing, their branches like skeletal fingers stretching out over the road. The headlights of the car cut through the darkness, casting eerie shadows that flickered and danced at the edges of their vision. Rahul glanced at the clock. It was well past midnight, and the forest seemed unnervingly still. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just the hum of the engine and the occasional bump as the car rolled over cracks in the weathered asphalt. "Man, this road is giving me the creeps," Mehul, sitting in the passenger seat, muttered, breaking the silence. "Feels like we're the only ones out here." Rahul chuckled, trying to shake off the unease creeping up his spine. "Relax, it's just an old road. We'll be home before you know it." But even he didn't fully believe his own words. Suddenly, up ahead, something caught his eye. At first, it was just a faint shape in the distance, barely visible in the dim light of the headlights. As they drove closer, the shape became clearer, and Rahul's heart skipped a beat. A woman stood at the side of the road. She was dressed in white, an old-fashioned sari by the looks of it. Her long black hair was tangled and hung loose over her shoulders, and she appeared to be barefoot. The way she stood, so still and quiet, sent a chill down Rahul's spine. Her face was pale, almost glowing in the moonlight, but it was her eyes, wide, hollow, and unblinking, that unsettled him the most. "Whoa, what the hell is she doing out here?" Mehul asked, his voice now tinged with apprehension. "Should we stop?" One of their friends, Ria, whispered from the back seat. sounding uneasy. Maybe she needs help. Rahul hesitated, his foot hovering over the brake. Something inside him screamed not to stop, not to engage, but at the same time he couldn't shake the feeling that they couldn't just leave her there. Against his better judgment, he slowly brought the car to a stop a few feet from the woman. She didn't move. She just stood there, watching them. Rahul rolled down the window slightly, enough to call out, "Do you need help, ma'am? Are you okay?" The woman turned her head slowly toward him, her face expressionless, her lips parted, and in a soft, almost whispering voice, she said, "Can you take me home? Please, I need to get home." Her voice sent a shiver down Rahul's spine. There was something off about the way she spoke, as if the words didn't quite belong to her. But before he could say anything, Mehul leaned out of the window and asked, "Where do you live? We can give you a ride." The woman stepped forward and slowly opened the back door of the car. She slid into the seat next to Ria without saying a word. Ria scooted over, clearly uncomfortable but trying not to show it. As they started driving again, the tension in the car was palpable. Rahul tried to focus on the road, but he couldn't help glancing at the woman in the rearview mirror. She sat completely still, staring straight ahead, her hands resting in her lap. She didn't speak, didn't blink. It was as though she wasn't really there. "So where exactly is your house?" Rahul asked, breaking the silence. For a moment there was no response. Then, in the same eerie whispers, she said, "Just up ahead, on the left." They continued driving, but as they passed bend after bend, there was no house in sight. The trees on either side of the road grew denser, and the darkness seemed to press in on them heavier than before. Minutes ticked by, and the sense of dread in the car grew. Mehul turned around in his seat and said, "Are you sure we're going the right way? We haven't seen any houses for miles." The woman didn't respond. She just sat there, staring ahead. Rahul's knuckles whitened as he gripped the steering wheel. Something was wrong, very wrong. His heart pounded in his chest, and his instincts screamed at him to stop the car, to get out, to run. But he couldn't. He felt trapped, as if the very road was pulling them deeper into something they couldn't escape. "Hey," Ria whispered, her voice trembling. "Something's not right. She's not." Ah. Before she could finish her sentence, the woman finally turned her head toward Rahul, locking eyes with him in the rearview mirror. Her face, once pale, now seemed distorted. Her features stretched, her eyes sunken and dark. Her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, too wide for her face. And then she whispered again, "I need to get home." That was when Rahul saw it. The back seat was empty. The woman had vanished. She was gone. "Stop the car!" Mehul shouted, his voice filled with panic. Rahul slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt in the middle of the road. They all jumped out, their breaths ragged, hearts racing. The night air was cold, and they stood in stunned silence, staring at the empty back seat. There was no trace of the woman. No footprints, no sign that she had ever been there. The road stretched behind them, empty and dark, and in the distance the faint sound of whispers floated on the wind, growing louder with each passing second. "Did you hear that?" Ria asked, her voice shaking. They all nodded, too terrified to speak. Suddenly, out of the corner of his eye, Rahul saw movement, something pale darting between the trees at the edge of the road. His heart pounded in his chest, and he stepped back, his legs trembling. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, surrounding them from all sides. "We need to go. Now," Mehul said, his voice barely a whisper. Without another word, they scrambled back into the car. Rahul floored the accelerator, and the car sped down the road, the shadows of the forest closing in behind them. The whispers faded into the distance, but the fear lingered. When they finally reached a small roadside dhaba, they pulled over, shaken and pale. They huddled together inside, ordering tea to calm their nerves. As they sat down, the old man behind the counter noticed their distressed faces and asked what had happened. Reluctantly, Rahul told him about the woman. The old man's face darkened. "You've seen her," he said in a low, somber voice. "She died on that road many years ago. A terrible accident. Her body was found in a ditch, but her spirit still wanders, trying to get home. Many travelers have seen her. She always asks for a ride, but she never stays long. She disappears before she can reach her destination." Rahul and his friends exchanged horrified glances. They had heard of such stories before, but never believed they could be true, until that night. As they left the dhaba and got back on the road, they couldn't shake the feeling that the woman was still with them, watching from the shadows, waiting for her next chance to find a way home. The Haunted Cabin. Jessica Harper, a spirited and adventurous woman in her 30s, had always dreamed of escaping the hustle and bustle of city life in New York. Tired of the relentless pace and constant noise, she decided to spend a long weekend in a remote cabin nestled deep within the Appalachian Mountains. The cabin belonged to her late grandfather, a man she had fond memories of during her childhood. It had been years since she last visited, and she yearned to reconnect with her roots. As Jessica packed her car with supplies, she felt a sense of excitement bubbling inside her. The idea of immersing herself in nature surrounded by towering trees and the sounds of wildlife thrilled her. She drove for hours, following winding roads that led her deeper into the mountains. The sunlight began to fade as she approached the cabin, casting long shadows across the landscape. When she finally arrived, the cabin stood as she remembered. A quaint wooden structure with a rustic charm, partially hidden by overgrown shrubs. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, creating a soothing melody that welcomed her. Jessica stepped out of her car, breathing in the crisp mountain air, and felt a wave of nostalgia wash over her. Inside, the cabin was just as she recalled. The worn wooden floors creaked underfoot, and the faint smell of pine lingered in the air. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight streaming through the windows. She settled in, lighting a fire in the old stone fireplace to ward off the evening chill, and began unpacking her things. As night fell, Jessica settled into a cozy armchair with a mug of hot cocoa, the crackling fire providing warmth and comfort. But as the fire flickered, she felt an unsettling presence in the cabin. The air grew heavy, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Shaking off her unease, Jessica reminded herself that the cabin was simply old and creaky. She grabbed her laptop to do some work, but the strange sensation lingered. Every creak of the floorboards and rustle of leaves outside made her jump. Later that night, as she prepared for bed, Jessica heard a soft whispering sound coming from the other room. Her heart raced, and she stood frozen for a moment. The cabin had no electricity, and the only light came from the fire. With a mix of curiosity and trepidation, she tiptoed toward the source of the sound. As she entered the living room, the whispering faded, but she noticed something peculiar. A family photo hanging on the wall had shifted, tilting slightly to the left. She felt an inexplicable urge to adjust it, but as she reached out, a sudden chill swept through the room, sending shivers down her spine. "I must be tired," she muttered to herself, trying to rationalize the strange occurrences. She returned to her bedroom, but sleep eluded her. The feeling of being watched intensified, and shadows seemed to dance across the walls. Finally, exhaustion took over, and she drifted off into a restless sleep. The next morning, Jessica woke to the sun filtering through the window, dispelling the remnants of her anxiety. Determined to enjoy her getaway, she spent the day hiking through the beautiful trails surrounding the cabin. But every time she returned, the unease would creep back in, like an unwelcome guest. As night fell again, Jessica decided to confront her fears. She lit candles around the cabin, hoping to create a more inviting atmosphere. Settling down with a book, she felt a surge of courage. But as she read, the temperature dropped suddenly, and she heard a distinct knock on the door. Her heart raced as she glanced at the clock. It was past midnight. Summoning her courage, she stood up and opened the door, but no one was there. The forest stood silent, shrouded in darkness. Returning inside, Jessica noticed the air felt thicker, and she could hear faint whispers again. This time, they were clearer. "Help us! Help us!" The voices seemed to be pleading, echoing through the walls. Panic gripped her, but she knew she couldn't let fear control her. She grabbed a flashlight and ventured outside. "Who's there?" she called into the darkness. "What do you want?" To her astonishment, a figure materialized in front of her. A translucent woman dressed in old-fashioned clothing with sorrowful eyes that bore into her soul. Jessica's breath caught in her throat as the ghostly figure reached out, gesturing for her to follow. With her heart pounding, Jessica hesitated but felt an inexplicable pull toward the spirit. She followed the apparition into the woods, the whispers growing louder with every step. The woman led her to a clearing, where the moonlight illuminated an old, crumbling stone well. The spirit pointed down into the well, her eyes filled with desperation. Jessica felt a rush of understanding. This ghost was trying to communicate something important. "I'm here to help you," she said, her voice steady despite her fear. "What do you need?" The ghostly woman's expression softened, and for a fleeting moment, Jessica felt a deep connection, as if she were channeling the spirit's pain. "My children, they were lost here long ago," the spirit whispered, her voice barely audible. Jessica realized the well was a grave marker of sorts. Legends spoke of a family that had vanished in these woods years ago, their tragic tale buried in local lore. The spirit was seeking closure, a way to find peace and let go of her grief. "I'll find them," Jessica promised, her voice firm. "I'll tell their story." As she spoke, the ghostly figure began to fade, a serene smile appearing on her lips. "Thank you, thank you." The next day, Jessica spent hours researching the local history, uncovering the tragic tale of the family who had once lived in her grandfather's cabin. The children had fallen into the well, and their mother had searched for them until her last breath. With her newfound knowledge, Jessica decided to honor their memory. Back at the cabin, she gathered stones and flowers and created a small memorial by the well. She spent hours writing their story, detailing their lives and the tragedy that had befallen them. As she placed the stones around the well, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. From that moment on, the oppressive presence in the cabin lifted. The whispers turned into a gentle breeze, and the shadows receded. Jessica felt a warm energy envelop her, a sign that the spirits had found solace. As she packed her car to leave, she looked back at the cabin with gratitude. It had been a weekend filled with fear, but ultimately it became a journey of healing for her and the spirits trapped within those walls. Jessica promised herself she would return to visit, not just to escape, but to remember and honor the lost souls who had guided her on this unexpected adventure. With a smile on her face and a sense of purpose in her heart, she drove away, knowing she had forged a connection that transcended time, helping spirits find peace while reclaiming her own. The mountains loomed behind her, standing tall and silent, guardians of the secrets they held as she set off into a bright new future. The Girl in the Mirror. Ravi had always been intrigued by his grandmother's house. It was a sprawling old estate, tucked away in a quiet town, surrounded by tall trees that cast shadows over its time-worn facade. The house had a certain charm, with its creaky wooden floors, faded wallpaper, and the faint scent of jasmine that always lingered in the air. But there was one part of the house that Ravi could never quite shake off, the antique mirror in the upstairs hallway. It wasn't just any mirror. It was massive, nearly as tall as the ceiling, framed in ornate dark wood, with intricate carvings of faces and animals that seemed to twist and writhe the longer you stared at them. The glass was foggy and distorted, making reflections look hazy, almost like they were behind a veil of mist. Ever since he was a child, his grandmother had warned him, "Never look into that mirror at night, Ravi. Some things don't belong in this world, and they tend to show themselves when you least expect it." He never understood what she meant and chalked it up to old superstitions, but something about her tone always gave him pause. As the years passed, the mirror became just another piece of the house's odd charm. His visits to the house were infrequent as he grew older, with school, friends, and city life occupying his time. But on one particular weekend, Ravi found himself back at his grandmother's house. She was recovering from a mild illness, and his parents had asked him to stay with her for a few days. The house seemed quieter than usual, perhaps because of the late hour, and after a long day of helping around, Ravi decided to settle in for a late-night movie marathon. He grabbed some snacks, curled up on the couch in the living room, and let the hours slip by as he lost himself in the flickering glow of the television. By the time the third movie ended, it was past midnight, and the house was plunged into a deep silence. Ravi yawned and stretched, deciding it was time to head upstairs to bed. As he made his way down the dark hallway, his steps slowed when he reached the spot where the mirror hung. In the dim light, the glass seemed darker than usual, the reflection murky and unclear. He felt an odd pull, something deep inside urging him to just take a quick look. "It's just a mirror," he muttered under his breath. He remembered his grandmother's warning, but it seemed silly now, an old woman's tale. Still, there was a strange feeling in the pit of his stomach. His eyes darted to the mirror's surface, and for a moment nothing seemed out of the ordinary. His own tired face stared back at him. He was about to walk away when something strange caught his eye. His reflection didn't move. It was still looking directly at him, even though he had already started to turn away. Ravi stopped dead in his tracks, his heart racing. Slowly, he turned back to the mirror. His reflection was still there, but there was something wrong. Terribly wrong. His reflection's eyes were locked onto his, but the rest of its body seemed to twitch, almost as if it were struggling to maintain form. The skin in the reflection looked off, like it was rippling under some invisible force. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and looked again, hoping it was just his tired mind playing tricks on him. But this time, the reflection did something that froze the blood in his veins. It smiled. A wide, unnatural grin stretched across its face, one that didn't match the terror Ravi felt rising in his chest. The reflection lifted a hand and waved, but its movement was slow, jerky, and grotesque, as though its arm was being forced to move by something else. Ravi stumbled backward, his breath quickening. The air in the hallway seemed to grow colder, and a faint humming sound began to fill his ears. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the mirror. His reflection's eyes, though still fixed on his, had begun to darken, turning a deep, soulless black. And then, as if the mirror had come alive, the reflection's hand reached out. The glass rippled like water, and the pale hand emerged from the mirror, inching toward Ravi. He could feel the cold radiating from it, an unnatural chill that sent shivers down his spine. Panicked, Ravi turned and bolted down the hallway, racing to his bedroom. His heart pounded in his chest as he slammed the door shut behind him, locking it with trembling hands. He pressed his back against the door, breathing heavily, trying to convince himself that it was all just a dream, a hallucination from lack of sleep. But the soft whispers outside his door told him otherwise. They were faint at first, barely audible over the sound of his ragged breathing. But as the minutes passed, the whispers grew louder, clearer. It was a voice, a woman's voice, calling his name. "Ravi, come back? Ravi?" The sound was coming from the hallway. He could feel the icy presence growing stronger, creeping under the door. The whispers became more insistent, more urgent. "Ravi, please, I just want to talk." The air in the room grew colder, and Ravi's breath began to fog in front of him. He backed away from the door, his eyes wide with fear. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there, whatever was in that mirror, wasn't just trying to scare him. It was trying to reach him. Desperate, Ravi ran to the window, contemplating whether to climb out and flee, but the second-story drop was too high. He was trapped. The whispers continued for what felt like hours, though in reality it was only a few minutes. Then, just as suddenly as they had begun, if they stopped, the room fell into an eerie silence. Ravi stood frozen, waiting for something, anything to happen. But there was only silence. Cautiously, he crept back to the door and pressed his ear against it. Nothing. Summoning all his courage, he slowly unlocked the door and peeked into the hallway. It was empty. The mirror stood at the far end, its surface now clear and still, reflecting nothing but the dim light of the hallway. Ravi shut the door again and spent the rest of the night wide awake, clutching a blanket and watching the door. The next morning, he wasted no time asking his grandmother about the mirror. Her face turned pale, and she quietly led him to the kitchen, away from the prying ears of the house. "The mirror belonged to the family that lived here before us," she explained in a low voice. "There was a girl, about your age, who disappeared one night. She was last seen playing in front of that mirror. After she vanished, strange things started happening in the house. They say her spirit became trapped inside it." Ravi stared at his grandmother, the weight of her words sinking in. He couldn't shake the image of that pale hand reaching for him, or the eerie smile on his reflection's face. "I've told you never to look into it at night," his grandmother continued. "Some things are best left alone. The mirror, it shows things that don't belong in this world." Ravi never looked into the mirror again, but every time he visited the house after that, he could feel its presence, like it was watching him, waiting for another chance to show him what lay on the other side. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like, comment, and share the video. See you next time.